We used to call each other Hun. Then about 10 years ago, that became Attila.
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Colton Ogburn, and these are all the Easter eggs, references, and little things you might have missed in Severance Season 2, Episode 6, Attila. Guys, I think I have finally cracked the code, so to speak, on what is happening in Severance, and all of the secrets lie in this H.P. Lovecraft book, The Shadow over Innsmouth. So we're going to take a closer look at that book and connect some shocking dots between the Lovecraft universe and the Severance universe, breaking down how Kier Eagon may actually be a god. And hey, be sure to check out our Praise Kier sticky note shirt up on the merch store right now, ScreenCrushmerch.com. And guys, I hate to say it, but a little later I want to talk about how I think Burt's outie is bad news.
Oh, no.
So this episode being titled Attila is of course in reference to Burt and Field's little pet name for one another, but we can't overlook the significance of name dropping Attila the Hun in this series. It goes without saying that Attila the Hun was one of the most gruesome barbarian conquerors the world has ever seen. I mean, you guys do know history, right?
He knows history.
We have talked a lot about the similarities between Kier Eagon and tyrannical kings and rulers throughout history. Kier Eagon has modeled himself as this Christ-like savior of mankind, but I think we'll soon learn that he was a brutal tyrant similar to that of the aforementioned Attila the Hun. So we open with Mark explaining the reintegration experience he had in the final moments from the previous episode, in which he came face to face with Miss Casey, or as he knows her, his late wife Gemma. Mark asks,
I mean, why is she rattling off a bunch of facts?
A reference to him hearing her voice from a wellness session giving his any facts about his outie. So Ragabi says,
all I know is she's essential.
Now, one of the biggest questions I have every single time I watch this show is why Mark? Why Gemma? Why Devin and Rickon? What does Lumon want with Mark and his family? And why are they all so crucial to this earth-shattering grand plan that they have in motion over at Lumon? Why are Mark and Gemma so closely tied to this Cold Harbor project? We've discussed previously how Mark was a history professor, and we've seen connections to the Civil War with these paintings of Kier, as well as Cold Harbor being a battle from the Civil War. But it's beginning to look like Mark is really only essential to this whole thing because Gemma was essential to it first. So I'm anxious to see what Gemma's involvement was in this whole experiment prior to her death. We know that she too was a professor, but a Russian lit professor. Now I'm actually starting to wonder if perhaps Gemma got tied up with Lumon in her and Mark's attempts at having a baby, perhaps with some form of fertility treatment that she was keeping Mark in the dark about. But we shall see. Now, I have personally theorized that Gemma may really be dead and that Miss Casey is just a 3D printed recreation of Gemma. Mark did say, after all, that he saw her burned dead body. So I do think it's possible that if Lumon is trying to create these 3D printed clones, which is what I theorized these creepy things were in episode 4 of this season, perhaps Gemma is like a really advanced version of one of these things. But Ragabi actually says that Gemma is still alive within Miss Casey. The Gemma that Mark knows is still in there. So this either means that this really is her original body and she is simply severed, or perhaps her consciousness was transferred to this 3D printed body following her fleeting moments of life. As we've theorized here many times before, Lumon's ultimate goal is likely the resurrection of Kier Eagon and the achievement of immortality, similar to like Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars, and how he actually transferred his consciousness to a clone body.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Now, part of the process of achieving immortality would not only be the creation of a new body, but the transference of a consciousness into that new body. So perhaps Gemma was used as a test subject to perfect this process of resurrection, and Mark's connection to her old self is essential to rebuilding her mind.
Hey buddy, what you doing there?
Oh, me and Ryan are in a Borg alliance on Star Trek Fleet Command. We were fighting off a swarm together, and done. So guys, Star Trek Fleet Command is the sponsor of this video, and what I love about this game is that it's fun if you're a massive Star Trek fan, or if you're just a beginner to the franchise.
Well, what is it anyways?
Well, it's a strategy game where you recruit legendary characters to crew iconic ships, and you can send them off on away teams, a feature that I just unlocked. You can fight in global battles, join alliances, gather resources, and upgrade your fleet. So if you use my link in the description below or scan my QR code, you can download the game for free on mobile or PC. So the game takes place in the Kelvin timeline when the Romulans, Federation, and Klingons are on the verge of war. And you are an independent faction in the neutral zone. So as you progress through the game, you play missions for these various powers to vie for their favor. Obviously, you start off exploring new systems while you're building up your starbase with an academy, unlocking new technologies, and putting together your crew. The game pulls from all eras of Star Trek, so you can have, for instance, Lieutenant Picard from the episode Tapestry serving alongside Cadet Kirk.
Wow, you can use an alternate universe version of Picard?
Yes, exactly. And when you buy any bundle greater than $4.99, you unlock him. And I actually have him paired with Next Generation Data and Riker for extra bonuses. The game rewards you with tons of daily rewards and chests, including the crucial 7-day login streak. With this promotion, you get epic Romulan Captain Nero, who increases the damage of weapons by 40%. And this month, I am so excited to play the new event to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Star Trek Voyager. You play a story that picks up with 7 of 9, right after the series ended. You can unlock 7, Tuvok, and when you use the code Voyager30, you can unlock Neelix, the morale officer from Voyager. And there's another promo code that I'm putting in the description because it's really long. Don't forget to use my link or scan my QR code to download the game. The galaxy needs a leader. Will you answer the call? So scan this QR code or use our link and come find me in game. So Mark then mentions the 5 stages of grief. There's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Bargaining, you know what that is?
What do you mean?
Well, it's one of the stages.
We've seen Mark essentially go through each of these stages, but he specifically mentions bargaining. Bargaining is widely accepted as the grieving person's own negotiations with God. Mark is now in a position where he might have to remain true to promises that he made to a higher power in hopes of getting his wife back. And now that bill may actually come due.
Aren't you forgetting something? No! Pay your bill! Damn, who raised you?
We could also learn that Mark's negotiations with a higher power were actually negotiations with Kier Eagon himself. So in episode 4, we heard Irving say,
Hang in there.
which of course was a hint for Dylan to look behind this poster, which we saw in the previous episode. So Dylan found that note behind the poster and he's now sharing it with the class. Now, when they asked Dylan why he didn't bring the note with him, he says,
Okay, I don't want to get in trouble right now.
This is of course in reference to his new secret privilege of getting to visit with his Audie's wife. Dylan has gotten in trouble before for taking that card from O&D back in season 1, and he got busted, so he's worried that if he were to take that note, he would have got busted then as well. Now, in Milchek's office, we hear him speaking with Miss Wong.
You cannot graduate from this fellowship until I have deemed you wintertide material.
So all season with Miss Wong, we've been wondering,
Why are you a child?
it sounds like she is part of some type of internship here at Lumon, likely hoping to be accepted into a school called Wintertide, likely a Lumon-sponsored institution. It's very common for private organizations to actually fund universities, and it's like a rotating door. If you get into that university, you're pretty much guaranteed a corporate job at whatever big organization sponsors the school. Now, we also saw mention of Miss Wong being a Wintertide Fellow in this LinkedIn post by Lumon. So Wintertide, it essentially means wintertime, which it seems to always be in this mysterious fictional town of Kier PE. We still don't know what state PE actually stands for, but we have our theories. Now, many think that Kier PE is actually in the New England area of the US, and there's lots of evidence that points toward that. And I think that this Wintertide name drop may have just given us a major clue. So in my research of what Wintertide could be connected to or in reference to in this show, I went down quite the rabbit hole and started getting some more flashbacks to my True Detective Night Country coverage. Let me explain. It's no secret that Severance is essentially cosmic horror. Cosmic horror, also known as Lovecraftian horror, is a subgenre of science horror fiction that explores the fear of the unknown and the unknowable. It's often characterized by a sense of existential dread and insignificance, which, I mean, that's Severance. Severance. I just described Severance. And well, wouldn't you know it, there is a book that actually takes place in an alternate history written by science fiction writer Ruthanna Imries. Now, I personally have theorized here in our Severance coverage that this show might actually be taking place in an alternate history of its own, perhaps one where the Civil War or one of the World Wars had a different outcome. In my research, I found that Winter Tide is the second installment of a trilogy called the Innsmouth Legacy series. So I'm about to tell you all about this book and the H.P. Lovecraft story that inspired it. Now, as we go, I want you to keep Severance and all of its mysteries and storytelling beats at the front of your mind. And I promise you, I think I just cracked the connection between Kier Eagon, the devil, and Cthulhu. So the Innsmouth Legacy series takes place in the Cthulhu mythos universe. Now, the Cthulhu mythos is essentially a shared universe of stories that are inspired by the original writings of H.P. Lovecraft. It's called Cthulhu mythos because the beast, Cthulhu, was pretty much a centerpiece of all of Lovecraft's stories. Now, Cthulhu is essentially this cosmic entity that is worshipped by followers of various cults. So in this mythos, Cthulhu exists within the tomb of a sunken city in the Pacific Ocean, and he's been there for eons. Cthulhu awaits to one day be awoken and regain control of the planet, and he has the special ability of being able to possess one's mind and drive them mad. Sound familiar? I've talked ad nauseum about the connection between the severed floor and the 9 circles of hell being represented by the many levels beneath Lumon, and how at the bottom of the 9 circles of hell you would find the devil. But in this case, I think that devil would be Kier Eagon, awaiting his own resurrection and return to take over the planet. I mean, Mr. Drummond did say,
Mark Scout's completion of Cold Harbor will be remembered as one of the greatest moments in the history of this planet.
And this is all very similar to how at the bottom of the sea you would find a dormant Cthulhu awaiting his awakening. So the Innsmouth Legacy was inspired by the Lovecraft book The Shadow over Innsmouth. In that book, we follow the lead character as he investigates this decrepit town of Innsmouth, Massachusetts, which is in New England. Now, the town of Innsmouth is eerily similar to the town of Kier, especially with its seclusion from the outside world. They even have their own cult-like following similar to that of the cult of Kier. And the people of this town are even referred to as the Deep Ones, which could have inspired the concept of the severed being the Deep Ones, being that they exist beneath the surface. Okay, now moving over to the more recent series of books, which were inspired by this work of Lovecraft, we have Winter Tide. In this book, we have 2 groups of humans, the Deep Ones and the people of the air. Do I need to say it?
No, we get it. The innies are the deep ones and the outies are the people in the air. Keep going.
Well, that's pretty much it. And you know, in the previous episode, I talked about how this iceberg painting in Milchek's office was alluding to not only the depths of Lumon and the expression just the tip of the iceberg, but also how Severance is adapting the iceberg theory coined by Ernest Hemingway, keeping the story vague and
mysterious.
Lovecraft was another author whose style of writing was one of amplifying mystery and leaving a lot in the shadows for the reader to fill in their own mind. Mark tells Helly about him and Helena having sex. He finally tells her, and she is understandably feeling violated. Mark and Helly, you know, they were both taken advantage of in this situation by Helena. Helena lying to Mark and pretending to be this woman that he loves to seduce him into having sex. And that was a violation of him, and it was also a violation of Helly, not simply by having sex. I mean, an outie having sex while they're an outie is not a violation of their innie's bodily autonomy or anything, but what made it a violation in this case was that Helena was pretending to be Helly and infiltrated her and Mark's relationship. That's what makes it really screwed up. Now, after Helly had a chance to process all of this information, I am glad that we finally got to see her and Mark share vessels. But you know, it really just makes me hate Helena even more because she robbed Helly and Mark of this being their first time. I mean, yeah, it's Helly's first time, but Mark's first time was with Helena, and she robbed him of his first time getting to be with Helly. But look, that didn't change the fact that their first time was still super special, super romantic, and I'm really glad that they got to have that human experience. But it does worry me for what's going to happen when Mark is fully reintegrated and hopefully Miss Casey or Gemma is saved from Lumon, assuming that that really is her. Where will that leave Helly? I mean, even if Miss Casey wasn't a factor, what would be the path forward for Helly and Mark to have have a relationship in the outside world? Is there a scenario where Helena goes dark and Helly becomes the dominant consciousness? And I mean, what would it look like for Helly and Helena to go through the reintegration process and become the same person? I think if that were to happen, perhaps even down on the severed floor, because it would be Helly that would likely decide to go through with that operation, maybe we'd see Helena finally be pulled over to the good side. Throughout this season, she has seemed a little shaky, and I've even theorized that she doesn't seem fully on board with all of the Kier and Lumon stuff. So maybe there is a chance that a reintegration could mean a happy ending for Helly and Helena. We'll just have to see. So there's also this theory going around that Mark got Helena pregnant when they hooked up in the tent in episode 4, but now we're seeing Mark also have sex with Helly. Now, of course, they're the same person, they're the same body, but different consciousnesses were present when the baby was conceived. Whose baby is it? If she's pregnant, are they going to wonder, was this baby conceived when Helena was conscious? Was this baby conceived when Helly was conscious? Okay, so let me clean up that rambling stream of thought that I just had. It has been theorized by some biblical scholars that when the serpent seduced Eve, he actually seduced her into having sex with the devil, and that Eve then immediately shared this new thing she learned with Adam, and they had sex. Similar to how Helena, the devilish Eagon, seduced Mark into having sex. And then Mark, who would be the Eve in this situation, he then shared sex, something that he just experienced for the first time in his any life, and he shared that new thing that he learned from Helena with Helly, just like Eve shared it with Adam. And there's actually evidence for all of this beyond a thematic argument that actually comes down to perhaps a mistranslation type issue. In Hebrew, the word yada, which means to know or to have knowledge, it can also be translated as to have sex. And then of course there's the whole forbidden fruit thing that has allusions to sex. So anyway, it has been theorized that when Eve became pregnant with Cain and Abel, that Cain was actually the son of the devil and that Abel was the son of Adam because those two sexual encounters were so close together. Eve then became pregnant with twins, Cain and Abel, but they were twins with different fathers, which is an actual thing called heteropaternal superfecundation. So I wonder if she becomes pregnant with twins, could one of the children have been conceived with Helena and the other conceived with Helly? With these two sexual encounters having been so close together, could it result in her being pregnant with twins, but from two different sexual encounters? Both, of course, were with Mark, so they have the same father, and technically Helena and Helly are the same person, so they'd have the same mother. But if she is pregnant with twins as a result of those two separate sexual encounters, that could mean that one child was conceived with Helena at the wheel and the other was conceived with Helly at the wheel, all tying back into the Kier and Dieter, Cain and Abel twin thing that is going on at Lumon. We hear mention of woodworking and garage beer making.
You've had a lot of phases. Scuba diving, woodworking.
Wow, so my Audi's really diverse.
Garage beer making.
Now, this was likely a nice little reference to another great show, Breaking Bad. Jesse Pinkman aspired to be a woodworker, and Hank Schrader had the hobby of garage beer making. So during this visitation with Dylan and his Audie's wife, we can see behind them a wheat field. Now, wheat fields have been used in films like Gladiator to represent the afterlife, which is of course a key theme of this series with all of the religious imagery that the showrunners have placed throughout the show. But in the work of artist Van Gogh, he used wheat fields to represent the circle of life and the human experience. And that actually wouldn't be the only Van Gogh reference that we've gotten in this series. In the previous episode, when we saw the watermelon head of Irving and Dylan was eating the earpiece of the watermelon head, I talked about how that was Dylan like symbolizing that he's listening now. He told Irv that he should have listened. So now that we're seeing him eat Irv's ear, that's like demonstrating him listening. But one of our great viewers commented about how that was also like in reference to Van Gogh when he went kind of mad and cut off his left ear. So lots of Van Gogh references. Now, we're finally getting to see Dylan have a human experience. He is feeling love for the first time in his life. He is experiencing the physical contact of a hug. He's getting to be a human being, despite people like Miss Huang and Helena treating their innies as like subhuman animals who don't have true emotions or feelings. things, we are getting to see this season, and we saw it last season, that they're wrong about that. Innies are human, and we're getting to see Dylan experience that humanity. So I think that's a really nice touch. And with that humanity comes things like deception. We're seeing him deceive his fellow coworkers because he is feeling things like lust and love, and he's having his own selfish emotions, which that is what it is to be human. So over with Mr. Milchek, we see him trying to remove big words from his vocabulary.
You must eradicate from your essence childish folly. You must grow up.
And hey, I like a big word here and there. You do your thing, Mr. Milchek. Mr. Drummond can get bent. But in all seriousness, I really like what they're doing with Seth this season. You can see the conflict within him, and it makes him all the more interesting as essentially one of the show's antagonists. So Mark is continuing to experience reintegration sickness, resulting in a nosebleed, and this leads to one of the coolest reintegration scenes we have gotten so far. I've discussed before about how the life of an innie is essentially like a dream that the outie can't remember. It seems super real in the moment, and then it's just gone. When Mark essentially wakes up in his basement here and starts trying to remember where he just was, it's just like when you wake up from a fleeting dream and you're trying to remember what the dream was about.
Jeez, I just had the craziest dream where I bought $100 million vase.
So I loved the attention to detail here when we see Irving going to have dinner with Burt and Fields. He's combing his mustache before going in, just like how Felicia said Burt spent an hour fixing his hair before going to visit Irving.
He spent 2 hours on his hair the first time he went to visit you.
Now, similar to Helly and Mark S., and as we'll later see with Helena and Mark Scout, the infatuations that one feels can transcend the innie-outie barrier. So we finally got to spend some time with Christopher Walken's Burt in this episode. I have missed him dearly. He was one of my favorite parts of the first season. And with all that cowbell in episode 3, I have been eagerly awaiting his return. Now, I've commended Britt Lauer for her ability to play Helly and Helena so differently, down to simple nuances, like the way she carries the weight of her eyes. And Christopher Walken is doing the same thing with Burt. Burt's innie seemed like such a kind and genuine passive person, while his outie, for some reason, just gives me the creeps. There's something off about him. There's just something menacing. And you know, I actually felt this way before they got into the whole he's going to hell thing. Don't get me wrong, you know, he's a polite and funny guy. I loved this little joke when Irving first arrived at his door.
Hello. Who the hell are you?
But there's something before the whole hell conversation. There's something like behind that smile and the squinting of his eyes, and he just gives me the impression that we shouldn't trust him. And that feeling was then amplified as their dinner ensued. Now, we hear Burt's disdain for the Whole Mind Collective.
The Whole Mind people are off the deep end is my point.
The Whole Mind Collective being a group of activists who are against the severance procedure and Lumon. They believe that severed employees are forced to undergo the procedure and that it is tantamount to slavery, which, yeah, exactly. Burt says,
Well, as a matter of fact, I was guided to Lumon's store by Jesus.
Jesus Christ?
So the theory amongst Burt and Fields is that Burt's outie is already en route to eternal damnation, but that perhaps his innie, as a separate entity with their own soul, could make it into heaven with Fields. And my biggest question coming out of that was, what the hell did Burt do? I mean, the way that they are talking, he must have done something like truly awful in his younger years to be so convinced that he is destined for eternal hellfire.
I've been what you might call a scoundrel in my younger days.
Now, that wasn't the only awkward dinner scene taking place in Kier PE in this episode. Over with Mark, we see him dining at a Chinese place, and we see him given 2 fortune cookies at the end of his meal, a nice little touch of having 1 fortune for his innie and 1 fortune for his outie. And then we get the return of Helena, who we saw was following Mark in the previous episode, and again, she is just so different from Helly. I don't know how Britt Lauer does it, but it's insane how much I can love Helly and hate Helena just by the look on her face. Now, this isn't actually the first time we've seen these two interact. Helena and Mark had a brief exchange here in season 1.
Hey!
Sorry.
Maybe keep your eyes on the icy road.
An eerie reference likely to the car crash that killed Gemma. Now, Helena invites Mark to meet her father, to which Mark says,
You want to take me home to Dad already?
and then Helena says,
He'd be the first.
Once again reminding us that Helena is jealous of the love her Innie has found with Mark down on the severed floor, something that she's never experienced, likely because she has dedicated her entire life to serving her father and Lumon. So there's no doubt that we are feeling some sexual tension here between Helena and Mark, and that's a common theme throughout this episode. We're seeing it with Dylan's Innie and his Audie's wife, both of them feeling sexual tension for one another. Burt and Irving's Audie's, they are feeling sexual tension for one another. And now, Helena and Mark, same thing. Going back to the point that I made a little earlier that these romantic or lustful feelings tend to transcend the Innie-Audie barrier. Now, while Irving is over at Burt's, we do see Drummond break into Irving's house, making me wonder if Burt let Drummond know that Irving would be out at his house for dinner at this time. I say this because, one, throughout this whole dinner scene, as charming as Burt seems, something just seemed off about him. And we now know that he must have done something truly awful for he and his husband to both be convinced that he's going to hell. And we also got this little scene where Fields let it slip that Burt was totally working at Lumon 20 years ago, and I would assume is still involved with Lumon now, even after having been retired.
It wasn't 10 years ago, it was 20.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
And I have to say, the way that Burt reacted to Fields letting this little fact slip was super eerie, and Burt seemed pissed.
Maybe that's enough of that.
I should also mention that on these papers at Irving's house, we can see Burt's name. So Mark had initially turned down Ragabi on removing his severed chip and risking hemorrhage, but I loved that after his little run-in with Helena on the outside, it wasn't a run-in that made him feel all mushy about her. No. He saw it for what it was. He knows that he is being followed, and her showing up at the restaurant was all the confirmation Mark needed that he and Ragabi are closing in on Lumon and closing in on saving Gemma. So I thought it was great that we saw him race home and go forward with the procedure, and he is not falling for any of Helena's bullshit. And so Mark getting his chip removed is actually a part of the reintegration process that we haven't seen before. Petey never actually got to this step. His chip was still inside him when he died. Now, Mark says,
And what is that smell?
which is likely him experiencing something called parosmia, which is very common following severe head trauma. Now, for the past few episodes, as Mark has been experiencing reintegration, we've often seen Helly and Gemma glitch between one another, just like in this season's intro. This is showing us how Mark S. and Mark Scout have their two love interests and their feelings for these two women that they love. Those feelings are stored in the same part of their brain. And hey, that makes perfect sense. And you know, we have several episodes left to go this season, so I think we can safely assume that Mark is going to be okay, but damn, did he hit his head hard after just having a major surgery. I hope my boy is okay. So before we end, I wanted to expand upon this big reveal that Burt has totally been working at Lumon longer than the 12 years that the severance procedure has been public.
Like saying I worked at Lumon 20 years ago, which is, of course, before Severance even existed.
Of course.
You know, ever since the first time I met Burt's Audie back in season 1, something just felt off about him. The first time we heard him speak was at his retirement party in this video message.
This is kind of strange, but a lot of things about this job are.
And the message, you know, it seems nice enough, pleasant, but there's this little part at the end when he tells them that he's done recording, and it has always made me feel just a little off. It feels like the whole thing was a performance. He went from feeling like an employee to like he was kind of in charge. He just seemed a little elitist in his mannerisms, and the whole thing just felt like, okay, my little act is over. And at the time, this always made me think that maybe Burt's Audie was likely not a kind man, unlike his very pleasant Innie. So it's nice to see that I wasn't overthinking that little moment there from season 1 for all of this time. And I think that little nuanced moment there of him, you know, gesturing that he was done, I'm beginning to think that not only has Burt worked at Lumon longer than the 7 years we previously thought, but that he's been there even longer than the 12 years that the severance procedure has been public, likely meaning that Burt's Audie was a Lumon employee prior to the creation of his Innie. I think Burt's Audie could in fact be a higher up in the Lumon echelons, but I'm anxious to hear your theories and thoughts about Burt's true motives here with Irving down in the comments below, as well as what Helena is hoping to achieve by befriending Mark on the outside. I want to hear all your thoughts and theories and more down in the comments, or you can at me on Twitter, or you can find me over on our Discord, link in the description below. If you're new here, please do feel free to subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Colton Ogburn.